Brought his travelling support with him, which is lovely to see. And I'm sure we're in for a really interesting evening to hear about his exploits in Antarctica. So great to see you all here. Thank you very much for coming out. And pass on to Laurence, who will enthrall us all with his exciting trip. So thank you, Laurence. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. Everybody can hear me okay, can they? Okay. Let me start off with a few disclaimers. Firstly, I'm very much an amateur sailor, an amateur ski mountaineer, and not by any stretch of anybody's imagination an expert on Antarctic exploration, fauna, geography, or geopolitics. So the best way to look at this probably is as a what we did on our holidays type of talk. I hope it will be of interest to you, and certainly I think I have some nice photos to share with you, if nothing else. So, by way of a few words of background, this is a trip that took place some time ago, now back in 2012, so 10 years ago. It was a small trip that was independently organised, going from Ushuaia in Argentina to the Antarctic Peninsula, and spending a couple of weeks there doing some sailing, some ski mountaineering and some kayaking. There were 7 of us, 7 clients. We had to have a UIAA qualified guide. It's one of the conditions of getting off a boat in that part of the world. And we also had a professional skipper and mate, and I'll introduce you to them shortly. In terms of how this all came about, it really, I suppose, started in Hintertux in Austria around about November 2011. This photo is of Catherine celebrating her birthday, which occurred while we were away on a telemarking, sort of pre-season telemarking trip, if you like. And over dinner, conversation turned to sailing, trips, ski mountaineering. And one of the other people on the trip, Andrew Denton, said that he was thinking of organising a trip to Antarctica, and would we be interested? And we said, oh yes, that sounds nice. And didn't think very much more of it at the time. I fancied the idea partly because I'd done something similar the year before in Iceland, where we'd done some ski mountaineering based off a yacht up in the northwest of Iceland, which had been a very enjoyable trip. But anyway, as I say, we didn't think too much more of it at the time until the following year, early in the year, when I got some emails from Andrew saying, well, we think this is going to go ahead. Are you still interested? Do you want to come? And after we'd thought about it a little bit and I'd negotiated some time off work to allow me to make the trip, we said, well, yes, we're still interested and we still fancy the idea. So things progressed from there, really. We had a planning weekend in North Wales in the spring, where we went through the sorts of things we fancied doing, came up with a provisional itinerary, which we didn't keep to at all. Spent a lot of time talking about kit, lengthy discussions about whether we would take pulks and try and pull them along. And in the end, we decided not to, and we'll see later what we ended up pulling behind us. Insurance proved to be a problem. You can't really get rescued from the Antarctic Peninsula in any simple way. Certainly there are no helicopters going there. Fixed wing aircraft are not easily available. And you really are relying on yourselves and your own resources if you run into a problem and need to be rescued. But we eventually found somebody who would insure us for not very many eventualities and for a lot of money. Andrew took care of chartering a boat, and I'll say a bit more about our boat and the company that provides these charters down there. And then our guide, Nick Park, was a friend of Andrew's, and he was persuaded to come at reduced rates, because he was essentially using it as a dry run for trips that he was hoping to organise for his clients in future years. So that all went on throughout the early part of 2012, and by the time it got to November, we were all set and ready to go. So this obviously is Antarctica. It shows the extent of the ice. I don't have a pointer, but you can see in the top left there, that little sticky up thing is the Antarctic Peninsula, and that's where we were headed. Now, Antarctica is not flat, and this shows the heights above sea level for the various bits of Antarctica, and I think you can see, or hopefully you can see, up in the top left in the Antarctic Peninsula, there's some fairly high mountains. And the highest point in the peninsula is Mount Hope, also known as Mount Wakefield, and that's 10,500 feet. I should say, in case anybody is querying that, there's another Mount Hope in the Ross Dependency, which was discovered by Shackleton, but this is a Mount Hope in the Antarctic Peninsula. And the highest point in Antarctica itself is in the Vinson Massif in the Sentinel Range at about 16,000 feet, and not climbed until 1966, in fact. So, looking a bit more in detail at the Antarctic Peninsula, we were interested in that little bit in the square. So, I think you can tell from that and the previous two slides, we didn't even scratch the surface, really, of what is a vast area at the bottom of our planet. So, we made our way to Ushuaia at the bottom of Argentina. We flew to Buenos Aires and then took a further flight down to Ushuaia, and spent a couple of days there sorting out some kit, introducing ourselves to the boat and introducing ourselves to our skipper and his mate. Ushuaia, known as the end of the world, is an interesting place. The English are not too popular there, and certainly 10 years ago, the Falklands War was still in many people's minds down there. There is an exhibition stroke sort of museum in Ushuaia commemorating the Falklands War, and telling it really from a very different perspective to the one that we got in the United Kingdom. Anyhow, that was Ushuaia. This is our skipper and his mate, so to speak. Their combined age was less than our average age. And this gave us some cause for anxiety initially. That proved to be completely unfounded, because they really were quite exceptional sea people, I suppose, with a huge amount of experience, and Antoine there in particular, a lot of experience in the Southern Ocean, taking trips backwards and forwards to Antarctica. So we were in extremely good hands in terms of the people looking after us on the boat. The boat itself, the Spirit of Sydney, is not owned by Antoine and Julie. It's owned by a company run by an Australian, Darryl, second name has escaped me for the moment, but he's been running charters down in that part of the world for decades, in fact. Boat itself was a 60-foot aluminium yacht built in 1986, so not a new boat. It had 9 berths, and there were 10 of us. So in addition to the 9 berths, it had what we christened a hobbit hole, which I'll try and point out in a moment. Our guide, Nick, was by some margin the shortest person on the trip. So he was democratically allocated the smallest berth on the boat, which coincidentally was next to the heads, and not a pleasant place to sleep. but that's life, I suppose. So this boat been in the Southern Ocean every season rather, since 1994. It was originally built for the British BOC Challenge race, round the world race. So it's a pretty well spec'd boat. It has been adapted for sailing in high latitudes. It's well insulated. It has good heating. It has a water maker adapted for high latitude sailing, and is well equipped. But it's pretty cramped. And I'm sorry, this is not in very good focus, but this is a sort of picture of the saloon. And as I say, quite cramped and old compared to some of the other yachts that we came across while we were there. Now, the Hobbit hole is behind the seat at the back there. So you have to take the seat out and then climb down into this little hole underneath the seat. The rest of us had comparatively luxurious accommodation in bunks, and you can see two of them on the left there, and then there were more bunks further forward through that watertight door. We were, however, very well provisioned with essential food and drink, and we're enjoying a glass or two of Argentinian red wine there. So we stayed in Ushuaia a couple of days. As I say, we got the boat all sorted out. We got all our kit onto the boat, of which there was a fair amount, and we set sail. So initially, from Ushuaia, we went down the Drake Passage to Puerto Williams, which is in Chile, and from there on to Puerto Toro. And we actually entered Antarctica for administrative and sort of border purposes from Chile, because this is a lot easier, apparently, than doing it from Argentina. One of the major advantages, really, of chartering a boat from a company that does a lot of trips down to this part of the world is that they deal with all this paperwork and administration for you, of which there is quite a lot. This just gives you an idea, hopefully, of where Puerto Williams and Puerto Toro is. I've taken these maps from Apple Maps, so they're not very well labelled, but I hope that gives some idea of where we were in relation to Argentina, Cape Horn and Antarctica. And there's a scale up in the top left which will help. There'll be a few more of these maps appear. The scales are not always the same on them, so just have a glance up at the scale if you can see it to try and orientate things a bit better. So this is Puerto Toro. It's a small fishing village right down the south end of Chile. This was where we first came across some of the other yachts that were waiting for a weather window to go across the Drake Passage to Antarctica. And we would come across two in particular called Selman Peau d'Orange, both French boats, a number of times over the ensuing weeks. Puerto Toro has a very good five-a-side football team who were able to comprehensively beat a combined team from all the yachts in the harbour during our stay there, and took quite considerable pleasure in doing it. But it was a nice place just to relax and muck about a bit for a day or so while we waited for the weather to be suitable to attempt a crossing of Drake Passage. So Drake Passage, it's a deep waterway between Cape Horn and the South Shetland Islands. It connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Despite the name, it was first traversed or first crossed in 1616 by a Flemish expedition. That should be 1616, led by a Wilhelm Schouten. It's about 11,000 feet deep on average. The winds come mainly from the west, and you get big swells because there's no significant landmass stopping these winds blowing the seas round and round the planet down there. It's also renowned for big storms and big weather systems moving through, and has a reputation for being potentially a dangerous sea crossing, and certainly one that can be very exciting for small boats and yachts. So this is a satellite image of the weather a couple of days before we left Puerto Toro, and there's a big weather system moving through the Drake Passage there, and we sort of got on the back of that and crossed just after it had passed. We had a remarkably calm crossing. Took us 4 days, from the 27th of November to the 1st of December. The winds on average about 15-25 knots, mostly from the southwest. We travelled 620 nautical miles to get to the Antarctic Peninsula. We had a watch system on the boat, 3 hours on and then off, and 2 of us on watch at any one time, with Antoine and Julie sort of supervising and getting up and helping us with navigation or sail changes or whatever when necessary. We had some quite substantial periods of motoring actually, because the wind was so light on occasions. It's dark, I'm sorry, it's night, nearly 24 hours a day once you get down here at this time of year. So really there was no significant night sailing involved during the passage there or back. So keeping an eye out for things at night wasn't too much of an issue, but there was radar on the boat, and obviously a sharp lookout is required, particularly as you get closer to Antarctica, looking out for ice and icebergs. This is our track from our chart plotter as we approached the Antarctic Peninsula, and you can see it's not a straight line. Where we started heading east and even northeast was where we first encountered sea ice, and we spent the best part of a day actually looking for a suitable passage through the sea ice to get down to the Antarctic Peninsula, which involves keeping a watch from up the mast on occasion and from the front of the boat, occasionally having to move small bergs away from the bow of the boat with a boat hook. Although this is an aluminium boat, it hasn't been strengthened, so it's not up to bashing through significant thicknesses of sea ice. But anyway, we eventually found a way through, and eventually we passed down between Brabant and Anvers Island, which you can see, which are not labelled on that chart, but it's the 2 big islands that we passed between there into the Neumayer Channel, which lies between Anvers Island and Winke Islands. So this is an evening cruise down the Neumayer Channel. That's Anvers Island, you can see on the right, and we're heading here towards Port Lochroy, which was going to be our first stop. Another view of Anvers Island. This is probably a good time to mention that the weather was awful, and we had 2 weeks of this, and it was miserable. Everybody we spoke to said that the weather that season was exceptional, and nobody could remember such a long settled period of good weather in the Antarctic Peninsula. So we were incredibly lucky in terms of the time we chose to go. And there we have more of Anvers Island and the Neumayer Channel. So that took us to Port Lochroy. This is actually a bay on the western side of Winke Island. There is an Antarctic station there of the same name on a little island in the bay called Goudier Island. This is the most southerly operational post office in the world, according to Wikipedia. And also according to Wikipedia, they process about 70,000 pieces of mail sent by 18,000 visitors each year. And these visitors are almost entirely people on cruise ships. So this is a very popular cruise ship destination. It was originally a whaling station between about 1911 and 1931. The British military Operation Tabarin was established there in World War II, and it continued to operate as a British research station until about 1962, when it was taken over by the United Kingdom Antarctic Heritage Trust, who currently staff the post office, and also a small museum which is attached to it. So on the top left there you can see a cruise ship, and in front of it is Spirit of Sydney, our yacht, moored against the sea ice there. A couple of pictures of the museum inside the buildings at Port Lochroy, and one of the sledges that used to be used and pulled by the dogs. Just visible in that one on the top right are some penguins. There were lots of penguins here. While we were here, I got a 2-for-1 offer for pizza from Bear's Den in Glasgow, pinged to my phone. We were going to accept it, but thought that delivery might be a bit of an issue for them. But just goes to show that you can't, even 10 years ago, you couldn't escape your mobile phone unless you turn it off. We also found ourselves part of the wildlife because the cruise ship would send people ashore in Zodiac dinghies to visit the post office and send their postcard back home, and they also sent Zodiacs to whiz round our boat and take pictures of us as sort of interesting local fauna. We had our first night on the ice here. So this is sea ice. It's about 1 meter thick. The boat is tied to it. It's not still and it's not quiet, and you certainly notice that at night. It moves and you get a lot of noise. I know Myrtle will be familiar with that experience, having spent many more nights than I have on the sea ice, but it was quite a novel experience for us. While we were in Port Lochroy, we had a go at this, which is Mont Jabé. It's just up behind the bay there, and it gave us an opportunity to get our ski mountaineering gear out, and you can just see, I think, some little figures down the bottom left there on their way up to the col. Same thing here, looking back across, that's Anvers Island again. You can see across the Neumayer Strait there. And looking back down from the col to the bay, and it doesn't show very well, but you can just make out, I think, Port Lochroy buildings on the left there, and with the eye of faith, we can maybe see the yacht. And what's happening is that the sea ice is getting blown in from the channel and is starting to surround us, or surround the yacht. And it's more clear here. This is an issue if you're down in that part of the world in a yacht. The sea ice can blow in pretty quickly with the wind changes or the currents change, and your boat can be trapped if you're not careful. So we always had to have at least one person on the boat keeping an eye on the conditions at all times, and occasionally had to use the Zodiac there, or the dinghy, to clear a path through the sea ice so we could get out. So when this started happening, we decided to weigh anchor and head off. So from Port Lochroy, we went a short distance to Access Point on Anvers Island. On the right there, you can see Julie taking us ashore from our anchorage at Access Point. So this was the place where we had originally planned to do a trip which would involve us pulling our pulks and spending a couple of nights away from the boat camping. We were forced into a change of plans because one member of the group, Kevin, managed to do his back in lifting kit out of the hold, and was completely incapacitated for the best part of a week or 10 days afterwards, actually. We had some discussion at the time about whether we needed to try and get him evacuated on a cruise ship. He didn't seem to be developing any neurological complications of his, what I presume to be was a slip disc, which would have necessitated him needing an operation on an urgent basis. So after a bit of humming and hawing and discussion and so on, we opted to try and manage things with analgesics and some diazepam and some rest. But clearly he wasn't going to be pulling any porks for a while, or pulling any bags with kit in. So we changed our plans. We got off the boat, as you can see. We camped on the shore, and we had a look at some other options. That mountain you can see in the background there is Mount Minaret, or more Minaret. Two of our party, Nick, our guide, and Steve, who was a Canadian actually, who had previously skied with Nick, had a go at that and got to within what they think was 100 or 200 feet, 200 meters, of the summit. The rest of us did something a little less challenging. Another mountain which you couldn't see on the previous slide because it was just round to the right is Mount Hinson. And this picture shows us on the way up to a place called the Dorian Gap, which is a col beneath Mount Hinson. So the rest of us had a go at that. This shows us going up the northwest ridge of Mount Hinson, and we estimated that to be about a Scottish grade 2 winter climb, but that's maybe a little bit generous on our behalf. Certainly it was at about the limit of what I was thinking I was prepared to do in Antarctica, with no prospect of anybody coming to help me if we got into trouble. Andrew Denton spent a lot of time trying to find out if anybody had been up that route, and came to the conclusion that he couldn't find any evidence that anybody had. So we decided we would try and claim it as a new route. But whether that's true or not, I have no idea. What was certainly true was that we got a very nice ski back down in nice spring powder snow back to our campsite there. And all in all, a couple of days were judged to have been a success, even though they hadn't panned out quite as we had originally planned. So we were off again, this time down the Lemaire Channel to Vernadsky Station, which I'll say a few words about in a minute. This channel between the mainland and Booth Island is also known as Kodak Alley because of its spectacular scenery. So we had a lovely sail down that, a lot of whales and wildlife. We did a recce of Rasmussen Point on the mainland for a possible sort of access to get to Mount Scott and Mount Shackleton, and then went across the channel to Vernadsky Station, which was previously a British station called Faraday Station. So that just shows where the Lemaire Channel is, Rasmussen Point there, and then Vernadsky Station, just a short sail across from it. So it really is a spectacular place. It's 11 kilometers long, about 1,600 meters wide at its narrowest point. Not surprisingly, this is another major destination for cruise ships in the area. Apparently first seen by a German expedition in the 1870s, but not actually traversed by a boat until 1898, when a Belgian Antarctic expedition passed through it. And it was named after a Belgian explorer of the Congo, apparently, and I've no idea why. There's another view. One of the attractions of this channel is that the water is usually very calm because it's very sheltered from the swells that come in from the Pacific, and you get some really spectacular views and scenery. So Vernadsky Station, this proved to be our most difficult anchorage in terms of getting moored. We ended up with one line to the shore and 2 others round rocks in the bay. Getting one of the lines attached led to me getting a dunking in the water up to my waist, which I thought might be horrendous, but actually wasn't too bad. The Ukrainians who now occupy this base have a sauna on the edge of the island, and their plunge pool is straight into the sea out of the sauna. So previously, as I say, it was a British Faraday station established in 1947 on Winter Island, which is not its current location. It was moved there in 1954, and it was used for research into geophysics, meteorology, and ionospherics, and was one of the places where the hole in the ozone layer was first identified. The UK sold it to Ukraine for £1 in 1996. The Ukrainians have done it up with a nice bar from which they serve their own distilled spirit. They have a £1 coin taped to the bar, which they claim is what they paid for it with. They have a pool table, they have magic shows, they have showers, they have a good sick bay, and they were very hospitable and welcoming for us. And we were the first boat they had seen after the winter. So they had been a long time without seeing anybody other than each other. So we spent a night at that anchorage, and the next day we headed back across the channel to Rasmussen Point with the plan of tackling Mount Shackleton. This proved to be an unrealistic aspiration because Mount Shackleton is a long, long way up Wiggins Glacier, and we had not appreciated that or appreciated how slowly we would make progress when we headed off up the glacier. But that's our anchorage at Rasmussen Point. It's not actually our boat. It's one of the French boats that I mentioned earlier. Mount Shackleton, as I say, is quite a long way up Wiggins Glacier. It was first discovered by a French expedition under leadership of a guy called Charcot, who is, for anybody with a medical background here, is actually related to the Charcot or Charcot's joints in tertiary syphilis, but there you are, it's a small world. And he named it after Ernest Shackleton. I don't think Ernest Shackleton ever went anywhere near it, but I'm prepared to be corrected about that. At Rasmussen Point, there is a shelter, the Rasmussen Shelter, built in 1984 as an emergency refuge and a recreational shelter. Currently closed, but still used occasionally by Ukrainian personnel from Vernadsky Station, and still pretty well equipped and dry and warm. And this allowed Kevin, who you can see in the sleeping bag there, and his partner Izzy to get off the boat for the first time since he'd injured his back, and experience a bit of Antarctic air on shore, if you like. There's also a memorial there. This is a memorial to 3 members of the British Antarctic Survey, Jeff Hargreaves, Michael Walker and Graham Whitfield, who lost their lives on Mount Peary in 1976. So that's quite a sobering thing to find. This is us heading off up the Wiggins Glacier. You can see that we're pulling things. These are basically big PVC kit bags. And we've talked quite a lot about whether or not we would take pulks, and had eventually decided not to because of the bulk of them and the difficulty in storing them on the boat, and also the weight. These served us quite well, so we've got a couple of cords from the neck of the bag attached to the harnesses around our waist, and they slid pretty well over the snow and the ice. If you were on the flat or going uphill, they proved very difficult to manage if you were traversing a slope, because they keep sliding away down the slope, and almost impossible to control if you were skiing downhill, come and whack you in the back of the legs. when you were trying to turn. So a reasonable solution, but not ideal, I think, in retrospect. So we didn't pull them for half as long as we had intended to, and I suspect if we had been pulling them for days on end, we might have found that they weren't terribly robust. But anyway, we had a good trek up the Wiggins Glacier, realised we were never going to get to Mount Shackleton, and found ourselves a campsite on a col underneath an unnamed peak on the right-hand side as we were going up the glacier, with a spectacular view back over the glacier and up towards the north of the Antarctic Peninsula there. We tried an ascent up the north face of this peak, a lot of glaciers, and a big berg front at the top of the face, which defeated us or stopped us from getting to the summit by that route. We had a good ski down, or most of us did. That's the result of failing to land your telemark skis after jumping over a crevasse. Most of my nose, or at least the skin off it, is in the snow there, and the bandage is trying to stem the flow of blood from my face, which was quite copious. But that and Kevin's back injury were really the only medical issues, apart from a bit of seasickness, that we had during the entire trip. Andrew and his partner Steph and Nick managed to get to the top of that summit via a different route around the back of the peak. The rest of us went back, this is the following day, the rest of us went back down the glacier, a lovely ski actually, and found another unnamed peak closer to the shore, which we managed to ascend. From there, went back onto the boat and headed back up the Lemaire Channel. Now, I put this in partly because it's a nice photo, but mainly because it shows a pod of whales surfacing, and to remind me to say a little bit about the wildlife and the fauna of the region. It's spectacular, and I'm afraid I failed dismally to get any of it on film, which is why there are so few, or in fact no photos other than this of the wildlife. We saw a lot of whales, mostly minke whales. We saw albatross, terns, shags, petrels, penguins, lots of penguins, skuas, seals. So really, it's certainly not a lifeless place. There's an abundance of wildlife there. So we were on our way now to Paradise Harbour. And again, that map hopefully gives some idea of where it was located in relation to our previous stops. So not far from where we'd started off at Port Lockroy. So this is on the mainland of the Antarctic Peninsula in Graham Land. It got its name from the whalers that used to operate in that area. There are Argentinian and Chilean bases on the coast, which we didn't visit. There's also a shelter there built in honor of Gabriel Gonzalez Videla at the Chilean base, and that was put up in 1950, and he was the first head of state to visit Antarctica. So we were in Paradise Island. We split up. One group went up Mount Bank, North Ridge, and the rest of us ascended a peak on Bruce Island at about 470 meters. And this was the first time Kevin managed to get on his skis and come up with us to the top of this peak. That's myself and Catherine, who is here standing on the summit of this peak on Bruce Island. And that is somebody skiing back down. I'm not sure who. It's not me, because they're not telemark skis. But there we go. So a great ski back down, and another spectacular vista and spectacular location. And time for a glass of white wine and a snack while we wait for our lift back to the boat. So next stop and our final sort of visit to in the Antarctic Peninsula was to Enterprise Island, also known as Nansen Island, and on the left there's a chart plot that shows the route we sailed to it. First charted in 1898 and used by whalers in the 1900s. Another popular cruise ship destination, although we didn't see any while we were there. And this was about the only time during the 2 weeks that we were on the Antarctic Peninsula that the weather was less than wonderful. As we were arriving, you can see the clouds are starting to build up a bit. It's a popular place for yachts as well, mainly because there's an old whaler hulk in the bay that you can moor up against. That Spirit of Sydney moored against the hulk, not on our trip actually, because the weather was not that good when we were there, but it was a better picture than I had of our trip. And on the right, Antoine is preparing to dissect the mutton that we had on the back of the boat ever since we left Ushuaia. So it was well salted, and he's about to butcher it and barbecue it for our evening meal. We had a day kayaking here, some wonderful sort of bergs in the bay with holes that you could kayak through and peer through and muck about in. And so we spent a day in the sea kayaks and exploring. The cloud was down quite low on this particular day, so we couldn't really get up any hills with any prospect of being able to see where we were going or potentially find our way back. Next day, however, we managed to get up a peak on Nansen Island and ski down. Visibility was pretty poor, but again, it was a nice trip away from the boat. And that was the end of our trips off the boat and onto the ice. A bit of relaxation afterwards, a bit of rest for some, and then time to get the boat ready for the trip back across Drake Passage to Ushuaia. You can see our track back is a bit more direct than the track we took out. I enjoyed the sail back. Not everybody did, Catherine. And we had a bit more seasickness and queasiness. I mean, the weather again was pretty benign, but there are big swells that come and they take a while to get used to on a small boat. We saw lots of wildlife on the way back. We saw a fair number of icebergs, and in fact one had been reported just 30 miles south of the Cape by another yacht. We didn't see it, but icebergs extending quite a long way north. We saw a couple of yachts, a cruise ship, and a lot of penguins stuck on icebergs floating around on the way back. And then before we knew it, we were back in Puerto Williams to formally and officially return to Chile. So more paperwork there. Time for a trip to the Naval Club, which had a very nice bar in an old boat. Several other yachts again in the harbour while we were there. Nearly all French, and I think all the other yachts that we met while we were there had French crews and French guides and French clients. And from Puerto Williams back to Ushuaia, and a sort of celebratory evening meal in one of the restaurants up above the town, looking down the Beagle Channel there. So, in summary, I reckon we sailed about 1,300 nautical miles, sailed or motored. We had 4 nights on the ice, which was considerably fewer than we had planned. And in fact, we came back with mountains of dehydrated food that we hadn't eaten. That was partly as a result of Kevin's injury, and I think also our initial plans have probably been a bit over-optimistic given the logistic constraints of travelling in that part of the world, and also our collective abilities as sort of ski mountaineers. It was a great experience. What we did is summarised in that picture on the right. I'm sorry that it's not just as clear as it might have been. We really did have fantastic weather, and I would be very surprised if it would be as good again if I was to go back. But it is a very special place. Visit it if you can. And thanks very much for your attention.
Wow. Wow, wasn't that amazing? Wasn't that amazing? And you were absolutely blessed with the weather.
We were, yes.
That was just, what on earth did you do to deserve that? You must have led a very virtuous life.
Well, yes, entirely.
Questions. I mean, temperatures was one I was wondering about. What sort of temperatures were they? Daytime and nighttime. I was just particularly looking at your footwear when you were skiing, and were your feet cold?
No. Yes, I suppose they were. I mean, it was cold, but it was sunny, and it's not windy. Without the wind and in the sun, as long as you're well wrapped up, you don't tend to feel cold quite so much. So I was never uncomfortably cold. The boat down below was very warm. I didn't mention it, but in the pictures, or some of the pictures there, you could see it had a drip diesel heater in the main cabin, which keeps the place very warm, and it's almost idiot proof. It's got almost no moving parts, and just burns continuously and keeps the place warm and provides a second cooking surface. So we were always warm down below on the boat, and because the weather was so benign, never really terribly cold on the ice, apart from, I would say, when in the evenings when we were camping.
I was going to say,
not moving around.
Yeah, when the sun's gone and
well, sun never went.
I suppose
Dip down onto the horizon and be back up again. So we never really saw any darkness while we were there.
Okay. And what did you do when you were on the ice for cooking? It was just stoves and dehydrated food.
Yeah, we had. Andrew had sourced some Scandinavian, very calorie dense dehydrated meals that I think the Norwegian army use or something, and we had bucket loads of them. As I say, most of them we didn't eat, but yes, that was what we had when we were camping on the boat. We were very well provisioned, and we were getting cooked for by Antoine and Julie. Yeah.
So,
Are you saying you didn't take pulps with you? You just had bags. How did that work out with the bags?
Mixed, I think, would be my opinion on that. That there were big, heavy-duty PVC kit bags, basically, with a waterproof rolled top. We just attached two lines to them, attached them to our harnesses, and pulled them. And it works very well if you're on the flat or if you're going straight up. Doesn't work so well if you're going across, because they tend to slide down the hill and they tend to whack you in the back if you're skiing downhill. But I've skied with pulks as well, and they're certainly a lot easier to ski with, but they're also a lot heavier and they take up a lot more space. Storage space on the boat was pretty limited with 10 of us on board.
yeah.
Laurence, when you were pulling these bags, did you have skins or wax on the skis?
Skins.
Skins.
Yeah. So I was on telemark skis, everybody else was on ski mountaineering skis.
Yeah, go.
I was just interested about evacuation. You were saying potentially getting your friend out by a cruise ship.
Yeah.
Is it mostly self-rescue there, or is there an understanding that the people from the nearby bases will help out, or is there any companies that will come out and get some, or is it purely you have to get yourself or your team member out?
So certainly at that time, you were pretty much expected to sort yourself out, and in fact there was an expectation that people from the bases would not come and assist idiots getting into difficulties down there. Cruise ships, maybe you'll get a bit of help in a dire emergency from them, and I guess in a life-threatening emergency, the bases probably would help, but it was certainly discouraged, and nobody would insure you for rescue down there. And I think some of that came from Bear Grylls, who'd been down there a year or so before and knackered his shoulder trying to climb up something and had to be rescued, and it had cost an awful lot of money, and I think it made insurance companies very wary of insuring people for rescue down there. So we went with the expectation that if something bad happened, we would have to fix things ourselves. So we had a fairly comprehensive medical kit. I'm a surgeon by training. Catherine was a pathologist, or is a pathologist. We hope not to need her. So we had some expertise for dealing with with a fair number of eventualities, but I mean there are things which clearly you can't deal with that can happen on that sort of trip. So it's something to bear in mind if you're going down there. So.
Did you have someone you could call? Like, did you have, I guess, other medical staff in the UK or in Chile? You thought, in an emergency, if I need some advice, I can give them a call.
We didn't have anybody lined up to do that, but I guess we could have rustled somebody up. We had a satellite phone, and I mean we were in contact with Darryl and the people back at Ushuaia, and anybody else we wanted to get in touch with if we needed to. But advice at the end of the phone is all very well. It's if you haven't got the kit or the expertise in terms of hands to do it, it doesn't help terribly much. And we had books and drugs.
The snow conditions look very benign.
Yeah.
Alpine almost. And I would have expected it to be far worse than that. Is it common? As
on the basis of an N of 1 visit, I don't know, but you're right, the snow conditions were very benign. It was like spring powder most of the time. There were crevasses on the glaciers, clearly, which had to be circumvented. But the skiing was pretty easy and pleasant.
And it's not just telemarketing. It's easy.
Yeah, we have the evidence with your nose.
That's poor technique, difficult conditions.
There's a couple of answers.
Yeah, I was a question about the kayaking actually. So you don't see taking kayaks all the way down, and then it sounds like you only used them once. Were they a bit of a bad weather sort of backup? Last question, I've got another question.
Yeah, we used them more than once, or some members of the expedition used them more than once. I'm not a kayaker of any competence at all, so I didn't get in all that much. But certainly, I mean, Nick and Steve, they were out probably 3 or 4 times in the kayaks. But they were a good bad weather alternative if the visibility is poor.
And I was going to ask about finding near the icebergs, because I thought I'd understood that icebergs are quite dodgy because 2/3 of them is below.
Yeah.
You don't know what's melting below, which can then change the centre of gravity so that without
They can topple over, yes.
Topple over. So I was a bit surprised to hear you being kind of panicking through gaps. Is that a normal thing to do just because the odds of it toppling over at the moment are there? It must be so inconsistent.
Yeah, I don't think we saw any topple over while we were there, but you're right, they do topple over. And none of the ones we were kayaking near were big, but obviously they create a bit of a wave when they topple over, and I'm sure that would have put me into the water if it had happened when I was in a kayak close to it. So maybe we were foolhardy, but we've lived to tell the tale. Yeah.
Yes, well, there's another hand up.
My question.
Oh, sorry. Telepathy going on there. Okay.
A bureaucratic question, you won't be surprised.
Mhm.
You said at one point that you needed to have a qualified guide with you.
Yeah.
Was this a requirement of the Chileans or the Argentinians, or was it on the Antarctic Peninsula? I mean, what are the bureaucratic hurdles you've got to negotiate to get there?
Yeah. My recollection, and this may be wrong, is that it was a requirement of the insurers of the boat. And it may also have been a requirement of the bureaucratic organisation that runs Antarctica, the name of which I forget at the moment, is that if you want to get off a boat in the Antarctic Peninsula and go on to
but you had to leave from Chile rather than from Argentina.
You didn't have to, but it's easier.
It was easier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before you went, you say on the boat, did the people who own the boat and the trip that you organised, did they have to sort of ascertain your experience to make sure that you were good telemarkers, that you had climbed, like, you know, if you go on treks and things, they check a little bit that you've actually don't have capability, or
Yeah,
you're not just a jolly person that wants to go on a boat trip.
No, I mean, they asked about your experience, but my view on that is that, you know, you can't believe what people say. So I guess that's one of the reasons you've got to have a UIAA qualified guide, is that he's responsible for your safety once
And
you're
he'll
off the
make a
boat.
judgment as to whether or not you can go
He
up
sh- he
climbing.
should do,
Yeah,
yes.
that sort of thing. Right,
And the
yeah.
skipper's responsible for your safety on
Yeah.
the boat. I think that's really how it works.
Right.
Yeah, the background.
When you were on the boat traveling, was it on sail power or engine power?
A mixture of the two. We did more motor sailing or more motoring than I thought we were going to before I went, and largely because quite often there was very little wind. But we did, we had good big chunks of sailing as well, and bits of motor sailing.
Have you sailed before? Or was this a mad first introduction to sailing?
No, I've sailed before. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, not the ideal place to learn. And just curious, when you were camping overnight on the ice, were there penguins about them? Because I've heard before that they can be curious and smelly, and that
They're certainly smelly. I don't remember there being penguins at Port Rockaway around the tent. Do you?
no, they didn't come.
Loads of
They
them
never
around
come-
the building.
Yeah,
but I don't remember
they
them
didn't
coming and poking their beaks into the tent.
Right.
No.
But that other place that we camped, there was penguins around about the tent there.
Yeah,
What access point?
you did well to, not to photo any.
Well, I've got some photos of them, but they're all rubbish, I'm afraid. So I opted not to show them. There's no shortage of them.
Yeah,
That's
but there were some stunning images in your photos. So it's beautiful. Yes.
What was the best prevention of seasickness and what's the recommended program?
Well, Catherine's the best person to answer. I wasn't seasick.
Whatever I took, it didn't work.
I'm rarely seasick on a boat. I get a bit queasy, but I don't throw up. Catherine suffers much more than I do. But we tried most things: Stemetil, hyacinth patches, ginger, anything. And if you're susceptible to it, nothing's going to work until your brain, acclimatizes to the motion and it sorts itself out.
The obvious question to ask is, would you go back, or what's next?
I would certainly go back. We've both got a number of other things on our to-do list that maybe we should do first. And I think might be disappointed if I went back and the weather was rubbish.
Yeah.
Which it could
That should be remarkable if it was the same again. Exactly. Any more?
So what next?
What next? We're doing a cycle from Somali to Nice next spring, and we're hoping to go back to the Himalayas in the autumn to do a trek, possibly around Kanchenjunga.
Oh,
I've got to get a new hip before
you need a surgeon.
that.
Really?
Dora shouldn't ask this question. I know how much it costs.
We're going to.
Gary's reticent, you can't ask him that.
Perhaps he hasn't. Perhaps I haven't discussed this.
Here we go.
Lovely.
No, that's not what I wanted.
I think
It's not a penguin. Hang on.
we're going to get the end.
No, I'm going to answer, but
You're going to get the inventory now.
Oh, no.
no, we'll get there in the end. Hang on. The answer is surprisingly little,
Relative.
relatively speaking. Ah. Sorry. Well, let me get it up on this screen and I can tell you. So we paid £6,700 each, excluding travel. The budget, whole budget, including insurance, kit that we bought, boat hire and so forth, was just under 49,000.
That's for all of you. For all of you. That's very good.
So bear in mind that's 10 year ago prices,
Yeah.
but even for then, that's substantially cheaper than
Yeah.
trips small group trips you could get with other providers. So
And how long does the trip last?
we were away for a month.
That's not cheap, but great value.
Yeah.
It is good. Yes.
Why are you taking a trip from
Don't.
Well, I can put you in touch with some guides who do run trips out there, a couple of whom I've skied with in other places. I could certainly recommend them if they're still doing it. They're getting older, like us, like we all are.
Okay, I'm looking around at any last questions. Yeah? We've given you a good grilling. Yeah, one final question.
Did you observe any pollution when you saw it while you were there? I know that's a long time ago from now.
Yeah.
It's much more talked about now than a decade plus ago.
I don't think we did really. I mean, you see some pollution is not the word, but you see some rubbish around the stations. Well, not rubbish is not the right word, but things that have been used and are waiting to be taken away. Pollution, not really, but I would be interested to see, how different it is now compared to 10 years ago, because I suspect it might be substantially different. Certainly in terms of the extent of the ice, for example.
That's reassuring, though. No Tesco's bags floating down the
No,
road.
we didn't see any
No, that's good.
plastic, did we? I'm sure it's there now,
Yeah.
in the fish, if nothing else.
Yes.
Okay, well, that was an amazing and very fascinating talk. So thank you very, very much for putting the time together and coming on. We have been live streaming this on YouTube, so for those of you watching on YouTube, I hope you've enjoyed it as well. And of course, it'll be there for all time. So if you want to go back and look at any have a recap on any of the talk, you can just plug into the YouTube channel and see it all again. You'll be able to go and watch yourselves.
No,
But no, thank you. It was tremendous.
Very horrifying thought.
Tremendous. Our next talk in a fortnight's time, so 2 weeks tonight, is another really fascinating talk we're going to get. Stuart McAleese, who is a senior guide at Glenmore Lodge, with a number of first ascents to his credit throughout the world, and one of which is down in Chile, in Torres de Paine area, where he did a first ascent last year, I think it was. So he'll be coming and sharing his climbing exploits with us in a fortnight's time. So it'd be great if you can come along to that and let other people know about it. It'd be good to see us there. If you don't receive emails from us, but would like to, then if you could just leave your email address on your way out, and then we'll add you to our emailing list, so you'll get notification of talks throughout the rest of the year. And we've got leaflets on some of the chairs, so if you want to take those away and again pass them on to others, that would be really helpful and really good. But great, thank you all very much for coming along. Thanks again, Laurence. It was a fantastic evening, and look forward to seeing you all again at a future talk. Thank you very much. Good night.